cohabitation. Je n'ai pas pensé beaucoup les humanités, mais ça m'a donné l'occasion de sortir un vieux texte que j'ai écrit sur l'intermédialité. Alors ce que je veux faire aujourd'hui, c'est de faire un peu de résumé de ce texte. Je pense que je vais parler en anglais, mais après, quand vous aurez des questions, si vous en avez des commentaires, je vous invite à le faire en français. Donc, the title of the text is Remains to be Seen, Intermediality, Ekphrasis and Institution. And I wrote this text about 10 years ago, when there was a conference about intermediality, which tried to assess what the concept of intermediality might have contributed, or might be contributing to our understanding of changes in the media landscape, and changes as well in the form of knowledge. And I found inspiration in one of the lines from the Appel à communication, which is the following. La recherche et les pratiques intermédiaires sont-elles en mesure de traquer les traces de ces changements à l'œuvre, c'est-à-dire les changements dans le savoir, mais aussi dans le monde des médias, ou se constituent elles-mêmes comme traces, point de cristallisation, lieu d'expression des enjeux de notre modernité? So the paper started off as a question about intermediality, whether intermediality was a concept that could describe what was happening today, or whether it's a symptom of what is happening today. And this was the point of departure for this reflection. Is it a concept that describes all the changes that we're going through, or is it actually a symptom of those changes? Or is it both? And the first moment of the reflection was to try to turn the concept back on itself and try to understand the concept as a way of understanding changes in the university. What does the concept tell us about changes in the humanities? What does the concept tell us about changes in the university? What does the concept tell us about the place where we think? And what is this concept which is so rarefied, intermediality, and which is so inaccessible to anybody outside of the humanities and outside of specialists in intermediality? What does it tell us about the way that knowledge circulates in our society? So it was really an opportunity to think about the placeness of this concept that we were working on. I guess if you could ask about the placeness of poetry, as Virginia Woolf does, or the place where we speak from when we speak about culture, as Michel Desarteau does. And since poetry and culture are words that freely circulate, then I think that we should really think the placeness of the invention of a concept like intermediality. So this was the point of departure. This was for me the problem. How to think this concept in terms of placeness as a description of changes that are taking place beyond the university, as well as within the university, and as a symptom. Okay. So what I want to present is roughly in two parts. The first part is a meditation on the concept as a symptom of changes. And in order to think that, I think with certain people who've written about the university here in Montreal. So Bill Reading's The University in Ruins, which comes out in '96, I think, at Harvard. And then Michel Freytag, Le naufrage de l'université, qui est 95. Okay. So the first part of the paper that I wrote 10 years ago, but which is still curiously actual in the way that it addresses certain ongoing problems. The first part is on that. The second part is on intermediality and a certain use of intermediality that thinks itself as a symptom. In other words, it attempts to take mediality as a concept that is self-reflexive and that can describe changes which include itself as a symptom. So intermediality will think itself, describe itself as a symptom. And what's particularly interesting to me in that is the temporal lag between itself as a description and itself as a symptom. Because once it describes itself as a symptom, it changes that of which it is symptomatic. Okay? So there's a constant relay of temporal displacement. So the first part is really inspired in Bill Reading's, and I guess it wouldn't hurt to just run through some of his key concepts. Okay, the University in Ruins as well. The University in Ruins is his understanding of what the university was and what it no longer is. So the University in Ruins is for him the modern university. The university that is founded after a series of debates where there's a series of models, of which one wins in particular, which is von Humboldt's model. And what is interesting to him is the relationship between the state and the university. So one of the citations that I take from him is, the state protects the university safeguards the thought of the state, and each strives to realize the idea of national culture. For him, the university functions as, has an isomorphic relationship to the state. It reproduces subjects for the state and reproduces knowledge for the state through its subjects. What it wants to do is to ensure the continuation through generations of a national culture, to ensure the stability of the state. And what it wants to do as well is to create subjects who are inculcated with the need to acquire knowledge, or with the way of acquiring knowledge. So it's a very specific relationship between knowledge, the state, and the kind of subjects that are created through it. In order to ensure this, he points to two things. One is the concept of building. Building is a concept of culture, which circulated in Germany at the time, of course. Just to revisit what it means, it's culture as formation. The subject who is initiated in building will be constantly forming or seeking formation. This is in French, formation. Se forme continuellement. And the other one is the national literature. For him, national literature became, for readings, in readings understanding of the university, national literature becomes the center for the propagation of building and the consolidation of this kind of subjectivity in relationship to the state. One of the people that he talks about within this logic is of course Matthew Arnold. In other words, why does he talk about Matthew Arnold's Culture and Anarchy? A thesis of Matthew Arnold on Culture and Anarchy posit that culture, national literature, will be a rampart against the expansion of technologies, industrial technologies of communication, to ensure the integrity of the national culture. Okay, so here's another brief citation. Culture turns technology into the mode of self-knowledge of a people, and it turns the organicism of the lost community into a living principle of identity rather than a closed system. So what he insists on is how the university ensures this. One of the ways that it ensures this through national literature, through national culture, through an idea of building, but also pedagogically through what he calls a pedagogical chronotype, which is a specific instance of how this national literature is imparted. The way that's imparted is on university campuses, in classrooms like this, where there's immediate contact between a professor and students, or immediate dialogue between students. And for him, this chronotype, this pedagogical chronotype, is fundamental to the way that we understand the propagation of this national culture through national literature, the consolidation and stabilization of the university. So for him, all these things are in ruins now. This university is in ruins. This university no longer works. The reasons he gives have to do with what he calls globalization and new technologies. Globalization has several facets that he discusses. I think probably the most important is the way neoliberalism has stopped funding state universities. The way that neoliberalism means cutbacks in funding for state universities, privatization of education. One of his models is University of Montreal. I mean, we see it everywhere today. One of the reasons that the book was translated recently is because it talks to us about what's happening. So when Stephen Harper says that only doctoral students working on business will have access to scholarships, he's basically talking he's basically saying what Bill Reagan said he would say well before. It's just a puppet for Bill Reagan. So this is probably the main thing. It's corporate funding and the necessity of corporate funding. There's another text by Masao Miyoshi that talks about this. He actually gives statistics about how much private education or university level education depends on corporate funding. And Michel Freytag is even worse. Michel Freytag says that all research is basically a competition for funding. And research is determined by the way that research groups manage to get themselves funded. So this is one of the first things. Globalization means neoliberalism. Neoliberalism means a certain economic program. And what this economic program has as a consequence is that university education is privatized and it's not national. So what we lose sight of is the necessity for national culture. It's not state, it's not national. This is one of the things that he underlines. The other one is virtual communication. So more and more, the University of Montreal is asking us to use Studium or WebCT. They're asking us to put courses online. They're asking us to put conferences online. They're asking us to give access to people to this kind of knowledge beyond the walls of the university. And what this means for Bill Readings is that the pedagogical chronotype that was so important for the propagation of national culture is compromised. It's compromised because the borders of the alma mater, which were isomorphic borders, like the borders of the national state, are in some way surpassed. Okay, so what's upset with this is not only the pedagogical chronotype, but also the Arnoldian balance between culture and technology. Right? Suddenly technology is dissolving national culture and taking us towards what Matthew Arnold would call anarchy, or would have called anarchy. Okay. So there's two models for the university. One is the state with national culture and national literature and a very specific understanding of a subject and of a certain form of pedagogy. And the other model is the new university, the university that is private, that is not restricted to national borders, and that implies, obviously, a different kind of subjectivity, although I don't recall him developing it so much. But what interests me is that this is where intermediality is invented. Intermediality is invented on the cusp of this change. This huge sea change is taking place in the university, and this is where intermediality comes. This is when it comes. Intermediality is something that never could have existed without funding. I remember when I wrote this paper, the Centre de Recherche sur l'Intermediality was trying to get Hydro-Quebec and other private corporations to fund conferences. So they were looking for funds not only in public domain, but also in private domain, not only from usual organisms that finance research like Ekphrasis, which was called something else, or CRSA, short, but also public-private mix and private mixes. Okay. So this is for sure one of the things that we have to take into account when we think about the placeness or the institutional juncture at which the concept emerges. The other thing that is important and that does take us right back to writings is just the prefix inter. Okay. Bill Readings talks about knowledge in this new university, and the importance that's given to certain prefixes, like inter, so interdisciplinary, interdepartmental, inter and transdisciplinary movements, intertrans, and the other one obviously would be post. For Readings, all these interdisciplinary movements are symptoms, again, of the disintegration of those borders that were borders within knowledge, like the borders of the alma mater, university and society, or like the greater national borders, all of these kind of isomorphically corresponding one to the other. What it really signals for him is, and there's another citation, the end of the reign of literary culture as the organizing discipline of the university's cultural mission. Because these interdisciplinary studies loosen the tie between the subject and the nation state. If national literature was the bond between the subject, conceived as he did, and the state, then these interdisciplinary studies, which actually attack the national canon, are loosening the bonds between the subject and the state. He admits that in many ways this is salutary because we can take into account how much the canon has excluded minorities, but that in itself is also symptomatic of the disintegration of this modern university. Miyoshi is a little bit more severe. He calls it the complicity, all these interdisciplinary studies, he calls them complicity in the TNC, transnational corporation version of neocolonialism. And then there's Arif Dirlik, who's written a lot about post-coloniality and postmodernism. He talks about post as nothing more than a symptom of transnational capitalism, which what it does is reproduces differentials of identity, which are then more marketable. It opens market niches in identity as marketable subjectivities. So intermediality is a symptom of this. Okay? How is intermediality only a symptom of this? How can we think of intermediality differently? I think intermediality is a symptom of it. I think it does signal that the university is in ruins. It does signal the advent of another way of thinking about knowledge, another way of relaying knowledge collectively through technologies. It is certainly a symptom of it. Now, is there any way to recuperate the concepts and to turn it back in on itself? Is there any way to make it a concept that can criticize the new university? Is there any way to make a concept out of intermediality that will be critical of what Bill Readings calls excellence? The other symptom, because I work on it, is cultural studies. Cultural studies is, for him, like post or trans or inter, a symptom of these new knowledges because it has no content. It's just input and output. There's no specific content to cultural studies. Anything is cultural studies. Everything is cultural studies. Everything. So it's just content. And because it's just content, it's something that is ideal for the new university because it just allows for the input and output of different kinds of information. Input, output, excellence are the words that he uses to describe the new knowledge formation. Doesn't have any identity content that links a subject to a national culture and to a national state, but it's empty information flow. So my question was that, okay, I think it's definitely a symptom. Now, if I started with the question of whether it's a symptom or a description, the second part of the paper tries to think of it as a concept that would allow us to describe itself as a symptom. It's a concept that has a certain self-reflexivity. It's a concept that can turn in back on itself. Certainly, if you look at the word itself, inter and mediality are both, the prefix and the substantive are both words that talk about field of action, right, in betweenness. So if intermediality is at once a description and a symptom, perhaps we can use it to reflexively think itself. Maybe we can use it to think itself as a symptom. And as I said before, what this means is a certain anachronistic lag. Okay. I think when I wrote this, I was probably reading supplementary and Derrida and all that. Okay. So the second part of the paper is about this lag. There's an anachronism. There's a possibility of thinking the concept as a symptom, which means that we're always behind ourselves. Because when we think it as a symptom, we change it as a symptom. We have to rethink it. So we're always in this anachronistic lag, this temporal lag, this supplementarity, if you want. And this is something that comes from Bill Readings as well. And Bill Readings is not only thinking the university in ruins, he was thinking the ruins of the university, or the university as ruins. And he was trying to think of these changes in terms of ruins, using the ruins as a trope, the ruins as a way of thinking, as a figure of thought. The ruins are always kind of circular. They always bring us back to another time, back to ourselves. There's a short story by Jorge Luis Borges, which is the circular ruins, which is that. And this is what I think intermediality can allow us to do. It can allow us to think the ruins. Okay? And here there's Readings who thinks that, here I'm going to cite a couple of people, ruins allow us to think the university. Thinking the ruins allow us to think the university as the sedimentation of historical differences that remind us that thought cannot be present to itself. We live in an institution and we live outside of it. Okay. Intermediality is like that. If we think of intermediality, thinking itself as a symptom, there's always an anachronistic lag. that confirms that with this concept, thought cannot be present to itself, like the ruins, which make thought not present to itself. And then in Simon Wortham's words, who's also written a book on the university, he's English, it's happening everywhere, right? I think thinking the ruins can allow us to think the university while letting the remains remain, letting them survive as remains. In other words, the anachronistic lag will never resolve the ruins. They'll always think the ruins as such. Okay? So intermediality will continuously be thinking itself. We'll always be coming back to ourselves to think about it. We'll always be thinking the placeness of the concept. We'll always be thinking about its symptomaticity, the same way that I've just presented it to you. Let me see if I can get it. I'm just going to read a couple lines here because when I wrote this it was clear. When I speak it, it's less so. Okay, this calls for an anachronistic thinking that projects intermediality beyond the institutional juncture of which it is a symptom, uses it to explain situations once removed from those it confronts, and takes the explanation as a sign of thought. It means making it turn back on its own purpose as the sign of a ruin it could make legible. Okay. So if intermediality is a symptom of the university in ruins, thinking that symptom can allow us to make those ruins legible, allow us to understand those ruins as ruins. So the question then was, okay, well, how do I think this anachronistically? What is the historicity that I want to make legible with this? And I thought that it would be interesting to compare it to another figure, which is a rhetorical figure, which is Ekphrasis. Why think it with Ekphrasis? Because Ekphrastics, well, for lots of reasons. Ekphrasis is a disciplinary, it comes from a disciplinary field which is most definitely in ruins. Ekphrasis is a figure that has always been connected to ruins. Ekphrasis is a figure which itself is always anachronistic. Ekphrasis is, for those who don't know, Ekphrasis is a verbal description of a visual work of art. Okay. That visual work of art can be a visual work of art that truly exists or not. That's less important. What's interesting to me is that it's always the description of something that supposedly comes before it. It's an image, it's an urn, okay? But that thing that it describes is always a pretext in both senses of words. It's always a pretext, it always comes before, and it's always something that's other than text in the sense of a written text, okay? A literary text. And finally, there's something else. It's that Ekphrasis is, and this is the importance of thinking that historically, Ekphrasis is something that is, like all rhetorical figures, has its own history. And what is particularly interesting to me is that Ekphrasis had a very strong moment in its own history at the beginning of the modern university. Okay. So in the early 1800s, there was, the English Romantics wrote and used Ekphrasis a lot for a lot of historical reasons that have to do with empire in England and France, that have to do with the expansion towards Greece, which have to do with the Elgin marbles. Some of you might be familiar with that. Which has to do with new archaeological digs, which has to do with Finkelman and new interest for classical culture, which has to do with a lot of things. But if you read Byron, or if you read Keats, or if you read Shelley, the interest is there and it's very strong. So there's a historical coincidence that makes Ekphrasis a figure that also coincides with the period I want to study. If intermediality is a symptom of the end of the modern university, Ekphrasis is a figure that circulates a lot at the beginning of the modern university. So if I want to think the modern university, and I want to think the ruins of the modern university, and if I want to think them anachronistically, then perhaps I can establish a kind of dialogue between the end, intermediality, and the beginning, Ekphrasis. Okay? So there are two concepts that have a lot in common. They're anachronistic. They cover the divide between one kind of medium and another kind of medium, the image, the text. And they have this historical coincidence where they find themselves at opposite poles, like bookends, of the history of the modern university. how to think this. There's two things that allow me to help me to think ekphrasis as an emblem of at the beginning of my university. Okay, and one is well, both of them coincide actually in Lessing, Laocoon. Lessing's Laocoon. I take Lessing for two reasons. First of all, because Lessing rejects ekphrasis. He hates it. He doesn't want to see it. And second of all, because Lessing can be read as a precursor for the disciplinary divides in the modern university. Okay. Lessing's argument is well known. Lessing argues that we have to divide the arts of time from the arts of space. Okay. But more than that, Lessing is actually a precursor to this. He's a precursor for the end of the Belles Lettres system, the Beaux-Arts system. He's a precursor for the end of the Poésies. He's the precursor for a number of debates on aesthetics. That if we take into account the importance of aesthetics in what Kant would call the conflict of the faculties, which was his way of participating in the debate about the modern university, then all these things help us understand how Lessing might have been a precursor. But there's more to Lessing. Lessing thought that the division of the arts and the control of the arts should be legislated. And he thought it should be legislated by the state. There should be laws controlling it. And what's more, when he talks about the division between one art and another, he talks about those divisions as borders. He uses a political discourse to talk of realms and borders and the separation from one country and another. And what's more, he rejects everything that's French. Because for him, the French confuse art with religion. So what is he positing? He's positing a state that controls and divides disciplinary knowledge that is secular, and whose borders are as firm as the disciplinary knowledges that are supposed to be divided. So he anticipates then a secular national space within which artifacts are produced and evaluated, and where cultural production takes on meaning according to a hierarchy of arts and disciplines. Okay? It's not just that the arts of time should be separate from the arts of space, but the arts of time are better. They're better. Arts of time can express artistic and inartistic things, whereas the arts of space, the image, can only express artistic things. The arts of time is a national poetry, what Schlegel will call a national poetry eventually. He anticipated Schlegel in this. National poetry that can speak of an identity of a people that goes further than art. The image can't. The image, why not? Because the image is universal. The image is accessible to everybody. Whereas in Europe, the national poetry is not. I'm sensitive to this because in Latin America, obviously, the question poses itself very difficult. Everybody speaks the same language. Okay. Now, why does he reject ekphrasis? If he wants a national secular space where arts are organized by hierarchy, where national poetry has a certain privilege, then why does he reject ekphrasis? He rejects ekphrasis. Specifically, he rejects in Homer a description of Achilles' shield. I don't know if you remember this. Okay. He rejects the description of Achilles' shield. Why does he reject the description of Achilles' shield? W.J.T. Mitchell wrote a very interesting text on Lessing, on these aspects. Some of what I've said, it comes from him. Where he tries to understand why there's a rejection of that. And he says that there's a rejection of it because what we see on the shield is actually everything that's excluded from the epic that Homer is singing. In other words, what's on the shield is what's excluded from the epic discourse, whose role is to give a foundational story to what will be understood as a national culture. For readings is clear on this. Readings for the Germans, for Schlegel especially, the Greeks are a model that are very important. So why does Lessing reject it? Lessing rejects it because on the shield we see everything that is not of the epic world. if the epic world is a foundational narrative for the integrity of a national identity, what the shield shows is social difference, social heterogeneity, social conflict. That has to be rejected. What we want is a linear narrative that speaks of identity, not a circular shield that speaks of social conflict. And what we need is a national poetry that will give us a linear narrative, that will be an identity narrative, and not a circular object that is an image and that speaks of social conflict and difference. So there's in Lessing a kind of a precursor to what we can understand as the national university, the modern university. Okay, there's a rejection of Ekphrasis. Okay, if there's a rejection of Ekphrasis that corresponds to the postulation of what would eventually become the modern university, what does an embrace of Ekphrasis mean? The modern university coincides with the use of Ekphrasis, or with the rejection of Ekphrasis, because it questions the division of borders that for Lessing is so important for a national character. And what does Ekphrasis do? What does it mean to embrace Ekphrasis? And this is where the Romantic poets come in. The Romantic poets embrace Ekphrasis. And what we see in the Romantic poets is, I don't think you can really get into a detailed reading of this, basically, for time constraints. What we see in the Romantic poets is a very different model of subjectivity, is a very different model of temporality, and it's a very different understanding of the world of culture. What are the modern universities? What is it? If we go back to Reagan's, what does the modern university have to do? It has to give us a national identity, a national culture, a national literature, a national narrative. It has to ensure an identity process that runs from the state to the university and to the subject. Okay? It has to ensure the division of borders and the singularity of that identity in relation to other identities that would be at the other side of the border. So all these things go together. It has to ensure that this identity will pass from one generation to another. And with the notion of Bildung, it has to ensure a certain notion of progress, an idea of progress. What do the Romantic poets do? The Romantic poets do everything that's opposite. Instead of linearity, narrative linearity, circularity. Like Achilles' shield, circularity. The example that I take is Ode on a Grecian Urn, which is the yarn, okay, which is a circular object. Ekphrasis has long been associated to circular objects. It's a classic text by Leo Spitzer on that. So instead of linearity, circularity. Instead of a linear temporality as well, you have a meditation on ruins. So it's a Grecian urn as a ruin, or it's the Roman gladiator as a ruin in Byron's Harold, Child Harold, I can't remember the name of it. Or there's the Parthenon, or there's the Colosseum. All of these are circular ruins. So there's a meditation on the ruin, not only as an object, but also as a certain kind of temporality. And finally, there's a meditation on subjectivity. When we sing. La collation, c'est bon?
Oui, mais est-ce que ça vous dérange sérieusement?
Pas du tout, non, ça me fait plaisir. There's a meditation on subjectivity, which is meditation on subjectivity, which is always incomplete. And, well, I'm not going to get into details of the reading that I have here, but what comes through in all these series of meditation is the importance of anachronistic thinking. So I'll just read a couple passages from Ode on a Grecian Urn. What I'm trying to insist upon is circularity, a heterogeneous temporality in relation to what Lessing would have liked, and also a different kind of subjectivity than Bildung, than that inculcated through the modern universe. And well, the first few verses read as follows. Thou still unravished bride of quietness, thou foster child of silence and slow time, sylvan historian, who canst thus express a flowery tale more sweetly than our rhyme? What leafy fringed legend haunts about thy shape, of deities, immortals, or both, in Tempe or in the dates of Arcady. And then the last stanza is, when old age shall this generation waste, thou shalt remain in midst of other woe than ours, a friend to man, to whom thou sayest, beauty is truth, truth beauty, that is all you know on earth and all you need to know. What's interesting to me is that Sylvan historian, the urn as a Sylvan historian, that remains, thou shalt remain. Okay. Do you know Odani Rishonim? It's a poet who's walking around an urn, and he asks a question of the urn. Okay. One of the questions he asks is, what leafy fringe haunts about thy shape? So as he circles the urn, he reads what's written around it. And what's written around it, you know this. Yeah, everybody knows this. Beauty is truth, truth, beauty is what he reads. So in the last stanza is cited. Beauty is truth, truth is beauty, it's in quotation marks. So ekphrasis is the literal, or the writerly description of an object of art, but ekphrasis also comes from to make speak out, to make something speak out. The quotation marks, and this is something I take from Agamemnon, the quotation marks in print retain what they originally signaled, which is a breathing rhythm. They retain a voice. Okay, so the quotation marks are intermedial, a sign of intermediality. They retain the voice of orality in written form. They make visible another mediality. So this ekphrasis, to make speak out, is something that goes from the image to writing, but also from the writing to orality. Okay? So there's these things that are happening there. And the circularity that takes the poet to go around the vessel. The time that it takes the poet to go around the vessel is the time that it takes the poet to come back to the original starting point. This is the time that is necessary to make the urn speak out, to give the image voice, but also to give the letter an oral dimension. So it's this temporal delay, which for me is anachronistic. It's this temporal delay that makes it speak out. Now what's speaking out? It's the poet, or the subject, asking questions of the urn. But then it's the poet who answers himself. It's as if the poet were speaking to the urn and the urn were echoing back what the poet is saying. How do I explain this originally? Oh yeah, okay. Sorry. The acoustic delay, okay, what was that? What is this? Where's this? I lost it because I didn't say the part of the poem that I need now. Oh yeah, okay, that's right. One of the first phrases he said is what wild ecstasy? What wild ecstasy do we see on your figures? The wild ecstasy that we see is in the reading that I do, which is actually more detailed than what I presented here, and a little bit more coherent. The wild ecstasy that we hear is the wild ecstasy of the subject speaking to itself. Subject speak to itself through different media. It writes, but what it hears is an oral echo of what is written. The oral echo that is retained in the inverted commas is the oral echo of the subject speaking to itself. So the ecstasy is actually the subject projecting itself out of itself. It's not building, which leads to a progressive accumulation of a subject inculcated to gather into itself a progressive form of knowledge. But it's an ecstatic subjectivity which projects itself beyond, through ekphrasis and through this combination, or this violation of the division between arts of time and arts of space, through this combination of written and oral registers. And then there's something else, oh yeah. What leafy fringed legend haunts about thy shape? Well, there's something else that haunts about thy shape, because what haunts about thy shape is the time that it takes the subject to circle ecstatically come back to its same position, to hear the echo of itself projected beyond, and to hear a response which is anachronistic. So what haunts about thy shape? The subject haunts about the shape. The subject circling the object, understanding the object through ekphrasis, is still haunting about it. So what's interesting to me is this anachronistic delay, and the way that this anachronistic delay speaks to us not only of ekphrasis as a kind of anachronism that includes always a pretext, a time before that gave, which is the time of the visual object, but also an anachronistic temporality that speaks of a kind of learning process that is other than the learning process that is properly building, and therefore a kind of subjectivity that is not the subjectivity that corresponds to the modern university and to the national state. What it allows us to see is an anachronistic form of knowledge that leads to different subjectivities and different forms of understanding the past and the ruins. So if we come back to intermediality, and this is kind of where I end, if we can establish a dialogue between intermediality and ekphrasis, we can make legible a certain historicity. That historicity is a historicity that will allow us to understand the history of the modern university, allow us to understand better the way that knowledge is produced. It allows us to form a critical position that can account for the concept of intermediality as a symptom and as a description of a symptom in a continuous relay. And finally, I think it allows us to understand what we're going towards. It can. I guess one of the things that is missing in this paper that I'd have to think through is the difference between the anachronism in Keats and the anachronism in intermediality. Keats wants to be anachronistic because Keats wants to question progress. He wants to question civilization. He wants to question industrial civilization, industrial progress, like all the Romantics do. Byron wants to be anachronistic because Byron wants to question Elgin, and he wants to question the Elgin marvels. He wants to question the pilfering of Greece by England. He wants to question England's imperial designs. For sure, he wants to be anachronistic because he wants to question all this progress that he sees. But obviously today, it's not industry and industrial progress, and it's not that kind of empire that we have to be anachronistic about. The temporal code that corresponds to the kind of power that Keats was questioning, or that Byron was questioning, is no longer the same. If they're questioning progress, industrial progress, but the progress that corresponds to a kind of capitalism in the 19th century, well, today we'd have to ask what the temporal code of capitalism is in order to understand how to be anachronistic. In that sense. It's not the same. We don't have to fight progress anymore. Progress is no longer the temporal code that is guiding knowledge acquisition. What we have to try to understand is 24/7. The temporal code today is 24/7. It's hyper-immediacy. It's immediacy through all these technologies. Yeah. It's the constancy, and we know this as professors. We have to answer as students. As anybody who owns a cell phone, anybody who thinks about Twitter, this hyper-constancy. So I think that if we can use intermediality to think of anachronism, well, I think it would be beneficial in order to understand the way that each of us, in the way that we acquire knowledge, in the way that we live inside the university, as Bill Greens would say, and live outside of it, and in the way that we are, as subjects in the world, restricted to certain impositions of time. So that's what I had to present today. I don't know if this really speaks to the humanities the way that you expected it to. So I think that it's a little bit abstract. I think that for those of you who are interested, I'd be happy to send you my paper. It's a lot more coherent, I think, than what I presented today. Mostly because I didn't have the time to present it properly. Because in today's university, we have the time for anything. Am I right? So I don't know if you have questions or comments or...
Quand vous parliez de cette singularité, de cette énonciation poétique et de ce délai circulaire permettant de recomposer la parole, moi j'ai pensé ça m'est venu à l'esprit, c'est un psychanalyste anglais qui se nomme Christopher Bolus, qui a beaucoup écrit en littérature, en fait, qui a fait des études de littérature et qui fait intervenir un concept qui est intéressant. Il reprend la réflexion de Winnicott sur l'objet transitionnel et il dit non, justement, c'est pas... Dans le fond, ce qu'il dit, c'est que les contraintes des symptômes et des pathologies contemporaines ne peuvent plus correspondre à ce que Winnicott proposait. Et, au lieu de parler d'objets transitionnels, il parle d'objets transformationnels. Et c'est intéressant parce que cette manière d'envisager, bon, dans le domaine de la psychanalyse, à la fois théoriquement et cliniquement, l'objet transformationnel lui permet de faire intervenir dans la cure analytique ce que vous décrivez, ce mouvement, évidemment, qui est assez singulier parce que en psychanalyse, on ne peut pas envisager un patient qui tourne autour de son analyste, encore que on sait jamais ce qui se passe dans un cabinet de psychanalyste. On peut envisager, moi j'en ai souvent eu le fantasme, de me lever et puis de commencer à vouloir hypnotiser mon psychanalyste en marchant autour de lui comme ça alors qu'il était assis dans son fauteuil. J'ai jamais osé vraiment faire des choses comme ça. Mais l'objet transformationnel, ce serait ça finalement. Et là, on serait dans un dispositif clinique qui serait fantasmatique, qui serait assez singulier, et que le propos de Bolus permettrait. Mais on est aussi dans un processus où la question du savoir se pose totalement différemment. C'est-à-dire que si l'objet est transformationnel et qu'il fait intervenir ce que Bolus, je le traduis de l'anglais, je pense qu'il parle du rapport à l'inconnu, ce qui n'est pas su plutôt qu'inconnu, ce qui n'est pas encore su. Et ça vient modifier, me semble-t-il, le rapport au savoir, à la façon dont le savoir est transmis, par exemple dans une salle de classe ou dans un séminaire. Je dirais aussi que ça vient aussi radicaliser cette conceptualisation de l'intermédialité qui me semble très symptomatique. Comment dire, je vais faire un aveu. Je viens d'un autre univers culturel. J'ai été longtemps professeur dans une autre université et on avait toujours l'impression d'être des ethnologues dans l'université plus proche du centre-ville, où on entendait parler de cette intermédialité qui nous semblait être une sorte de création foisonnante, conceptuellement rayonnante, absolument universalisante, mais et puis, comment dire, avec l'attitude un peu de la classe ouvrière, travaillant dans les bas quartiers, on se disait, oui, mais est-ce que ça marche? Au sens, est-ce que ça peut être opérationnalisé, même si le terme ne fonctionne... Mais vient un moment où on doit se poser cette question-là, est-ce que ça peut être opérationnel?
Non, mais il y a une question qui vient avant, c'est ce que ça veut dire.
Oui. Moi, je suis directeur du département, donc c'est intéressant, mais qu'est-ce que ça veut dire? Oui. Est-ce que ça peut être... Et est-ce que ça peut être compris au sens de qu'est-ce qu'on fait avec?
Oui, la question de l'accessibilité du savoir. Je sortais le livre de la bibliothèque, puis la bibliothécaire me demandait ça veut dire quoi ça, intermédialité? Puis j'étais jamais capable de lui répondre.
Ça me rassurait, parce que je suis arrivé ici, j'étais dans un état de simulation généralisée, constamment.
Ouais. Ben, quand j'ai présenté ce texte, dans la première version, en fait, c'était une conférence que j'ai donnée il y a 10 ans. Puis,
ça a été reçu comment?
Pas très bien, je me trouvais très sceptique.
Oui.
On a parlé de l'herméneutique, de hermeneutics of suspicion.
Ouais.
Peut-être avec raison. Parce que, effectivement, il faut le prendre comme symptôme. Si on peut le recycler pour faire que ce soit utile, en même temps, penser la contemporanéité, pour qu'on puisse penser le concept en tant que symptôme. Là, je vois l'utilité. Je l'utilise comme ça. La plupart des gens ne l'utilisent pas comme ça.
Non.
La semaine prochaine, je vais dans un congrès, puis un panel, c'est ACLA, American Comparative Literature Association. Il y a une table ronde sur Intermediality. Et j'ai vu les autres titres, puis les autres présentations. Puis on ne pense pas le concept en tant que tel. C'est comme un concept qu'on utilise de manière appliquée. L'autre chose qui manque dans la plupart des écrits sur l'intermédialité, c'est qu'on pensait sur l'historicité. Pas nécessairement du concept en soi, tel comme je présentais aujourd'hui. Moi, j'essaie de penser l'historicité de ce concept. Du concept. Mais des fois, on utilise le concept, mais toute la dimension d'une pensée historique est complètement manquante. Ici, à Montréal, ça c'est quelque chose, avec la revue Intermediality, c'est quelque chose qu'on essaie de penser constamment. Mais dans la plupart des manières qu'on utilise ce concept-là, d'autres concepts connexes comme comparative media, convergence, remediation, transmediality, c'est cette dimension de pensée historique qui est vraiment déficitaire. Ça c'est intéressant, ça en soi c'est intéressant par rapport à ce qu'il nous dit sur cette obsession d'être toujours à jour avec les concepts, ce foisonnement imaginaire qui est l'invention du concept d'intermédialité. Il faut que ce soit interdisciplinaire, puis ça parle des médias. Mais aussi avec la constance des technologies qui nous poussent toujours à être dans l'actualité, dans l'instant même. Puis c'est vraiment, il faut porter cette réflexion que j'ai faite aujourd'hui quelque part, c'est de penser l'anachronisme par rapport à l'actualité. Puis il y a un beau livre de Jonathan Curry que je vous recommande si vous travaillez sur ce sujet-là, 24/7, qui essaie de penser ça.
Je voulais retourner quand tu parlais de Bill Redding, par exemple, pour qui cette salle a été nommée.
C'est vrai.
Pendant longtemps, mais son portrait.
Il avait une image de lui.
Oui, il y avait une image.
Il était là.
Mais en tout cas, c'était là.
Pourquoi a-t-elle disparu?
Pardon?
Pourquoi a-t-elle disparu?
Bill Redding?
L'image.
Bill Redding, il était un prof ici.
Oui, je sais. Pourquoi l'image n'est plus là?
Non, je sais pas pourquoi.
Elle doit être bien.
Il y avait un remue-ménage un peu trop insensible, je sais pas. C'est un peu ça. Mais je voulais retourner à cet aspect de l'université en ruine et l'université comme ruine, et ce que ça implique par rapport à ce que tu nous as offert comme ça. Mais c'était intéressant pour moi parce que je pensais, quand tu parlais de Aude et de cela, du début du 19e siècle, ce qui est venu à mon esprit, c'est les tableaux d'Hubert Robert. Je ne sais pas si tu le connais, mais c'est le peintre fondateur du musée du Louvre. Et donc, il crée ces tableaux au moment même où il crée cette première grande institution publique avec son programme pédagogique, mais son programme aussi national. Oui, c'est le Louvre qui va en tout cas, qui sera beaucoup augmenté par Napoléon, bien sûr, quand il réussit à tout prendre de ces autres pays. Mais ce qui est intéressant avec les tableaux de Robert, c'est qu'il donne l'image de son propre musée déjà en ruine. Donc, c'est lui qui crée le Louvre, c'est lui qui est le premier conservateur du Louvre, avec cette grande ambition nationale, mais pour qui le musée est déjà en ruine, est une ruine, oui, et comme ruine. Et en même temps, il fait d'autres tableaux, par exemple avec des obélisques qui sont déjà cassés. Il y a l'obélisque qui est cassé, autour duquel dansent les jeunes filles, surtout, en bonnet républicain. Oui. Donc, c'est très intéressant comme par rapport aux oppositions que tu nous as expressées entre Billings par rapport à Ekphrasis, par exemple, d'autres façons de penser l'anachronisme au tout début d'un projet républicain national. Mais je pourrais trouver des images peut-être. Ici,
oui, mais en fait, c'est la fascination de la lumière avec les ruines.
Oui.
Donc, Lessing, que je citais, c'est un exemple de quelqu'un qui est inspiré par les ruines de l'Antiquité sous le signe de lumière. L'autre, le modèle principal, c'est Winkelmann.
Oui.
C'est là où l'archéologie moderne commence, puis c'est là où cette fascination commence. Sauf que dans le cas de Lessing, c'est comme une réappropriation des ruines pour un projet que dans ma lecture et dans la lecture d'autres, est un projet qui est vraiment national. Ce n'est pas la nation en ruine, sinon la nation qui est capable de s'approprier des ruines des autres. Et c'est ça toute la différence. Mais il y a des liens aussi qui sont plus directs aussi. Avec les Anglais, c'est de Elgin Marbles, c'est les marbres de Parthenon. Mais avec Napoléon, c'est l'Égypte. Et en fait, au début du 19e, l'Ekphrasis a cet essor-là, justement parce que c'est l'héritier de la fascination de lumière pour les ruines. Donc, ça commence avec Winkelmann, avec Lessing, puis après ça, il y a les excursions de Napoléon qui répatrie toutes ces ruines au Louvre. Il y a Elgin qui répatrie les ruines grecques pour le British Museum. Et c'est là où il commence à avoir des concours dans les universités. Oxford et Cambridge, il commence à avoir des concours de poésie où ils vont donner un prix à l'étudiant qui écrit la meilleure description poétique d'une œuvre d'art antique qu'ils auraient vue dans le Louvre ou dans le British Museum. Donc, il y a les deux côtés. Il y a le processus d'appropriation de cette antiquité-là, une culture qui se veut nationale et impériale. Et il y a la réaction des romantiques contre cette appropriation-là, qui est des fois très explicite, comme dans le cas de Byron, qui détestait Elgin. Et qui est des fois plus visible dans ces subtilités de manière de comprendre la temporalité, puis l'acquisition du savoir, puis la subjectivité qu'on voit dans Keats et d'autres.
Mais comment est-ce qu'on... parce qu'il y a toujours une ligne assez mince entre une pensée anachronique productrice et une pensée nostalgique déglobalisatrice. Et donc, je suis sûr que Reddings n'était pas nostalgique, par exemple, quand il parlait de l'université en ruine. Mais on peut très facilement prendre sa pensée vers une telle dérive. Donc, quelle sorte de distinction peut-on faire?
Ça, c'est une bonne question. Le spécialiste de l'Église peut-être.
Non, je suis désolé. Mais Reddings n'était pas nostalgique, ça c'est certain.
Non,
mais
exactement. Oui.
Ah, oui.
Oui, je le sais. Mais comment le sait-on? Ça veut dire qu'est-ce qu'il y a?
C'est pas nostalgique, mais il y a des choses que je pense qu'ils ne voyaient pas clairement. On peut voir plus clairement les choses aujourd'hui qu'ils voyaient. La question du temps, la temporalité, c'est quelque chose que je pense qu'ils ne voyaient pas aussi clairement qu'ils pouvaient voir de manière évidente. Et la question de la subjectivité, je pense qu'ils ne voyaient pas non plus où ça s'en aller. Mais je ne pense pas que c'était nostalgique non plus.
Ouais, moi je me permets là, de délirer un peu, là, mais permettez-moi. Mais on pourrait se dire aussi que l'université est aujourd'hui, en fait, comment dire, c'est l'imaginaire de la décharge publique aussi. C'est-à-dire qu'il y a les ruines, oui, mais on peut se poser la question aujourd'hui, est-ce que cet imaginaire des ruines est même encore possible? Est-ce que comment dire, le savoir tel qu'on se le représente, de Twitter à Facebook, est-ce que c'est pas devenu une sorte de mer des sargasses virtuelle
Ouais.
Et c'est finalement comme si c'était cette décharge publique qui a toujours été présente dans l'imaginaire, je dirais, peut-être moins de l'université, mais dans l'imaginaire des villes, puisqu'on construit constamment les villes sur, comment dire, des ossuaires, sur des décharges, et on comble et on constitue et on fonde finalement, on fonde constamment et on crée de l'origine sur ces décharges. Et je me demande si, en même temps que cette dimension de la subjectivité, de l'immédiateté, je dirais de l'absence même de délai dans le rapport question-réponse, s'il n'y a pas aussi cette décharge publique qui ne devient pas un élément très, très important de nos imaginaires. Hein? Une sorte de poubelle conceptuelle. Si on veut.
Ça, c'est très intéressant. Ça se peut que la ruine, parce qu'il l'utilise comme une figure de pensée, really. C'est pour ça qu'il n'est pas dans la nostalgie, parce que la ruine, c'est pas quelque chose qu'il faudrait récupérer ou reconstruire. C'est une manière de penser. Mais ça se peut que cette manière de penser, cette figure de pensée, la ruine en tant que figure de pensée, ça se peut que ce soit trop, par tradition, trop relié aux humanités.
Ouais,
c'est justement, on est en train de perdre la ruine parce qu'on perd les humanités en même temps. Avant, on avait des ruines urbaines. Aujourd'hui, on a le patrimoine.
Ben, c'est ça. Ouais.
Qui est un simulacre de ruines. Pas la même chose.
Et avec un façadisme et tout ce qui s'ensuit.
Exactement.
L'eau voyageur, de ce point de vue-là, sans faire de mauvaises blagues, c'est un bel exemple. Là, parce que c'est une fausse... En fait, c'est pas une ruine. C'est quelque chose qui n'a pas été érigé, qui est dans le paysage urbain depuis 5-6 ans maintenant, qui a coûté $1,5 milliard, qui coûte, en fait. Puis en même temps, ça me semble être, d'un point de vue symptomatique, quelque chose de tellement, je ne dirais pas représentatif, mais d'assez actuel, justement, quant à l'impossibilité. C'est-à-dire, au lieu de créer une université dans laquelle les ruines seraient une sorte de forme, on se retrouve avec autre chose, c'est-à-dire l'impossibilité même de... pas de fonder, j'aime pas le terme, ça peut être nostalgique, ça, mais quelque chose qui est plutôt... qui tiendrait lieu de béton, qui tiendrait lieu, je dirais, de béton précontraint, d'un imaginaire qui est tout autre, là, qui est beaucoup moins sophistiqué.
Différemment sophistiqué. Mais le patrimoine, je pense que c'est un bon exemple. C'est la ruine faite... actualisée. Mais actualisée pour toutes sortes de raisons qui n'ont rien à voir avec sécurité, avec cet édifice en tant que ruine. Donc là, une des personnes que je citais, c'est « Let the remains remain as remains », en tant que ruine. Et c'est justement ça, ce que l'on parle. Le patrimoine, c'est autre chose. Autre chose, c'est une manière d'actualiser les ruines pour qu'ils ne soient plus des ruines, justement. Et ça, ça va avec un présentisme. Et il y a un livre intéressant, le plus intéressant que j'ai lu dernièrement, c'est François Harel, qui parle de régime d'historicité. Et l'historicité actuelle, c'est un présentisme qui est toujours en train de s'élargir. Donc les ruines sont vraiment quelque chose du passé, d'un passé qui est quasiment irrécupérable. Et ça, c'est intéressant. Penser ça en termes des implications pour la pensée, pour la pensée des humanités, c'est quelque chose qui...
le miroir d'Hérodote, le miroir d'Hérodote d'Artog, et puis...
ça, c'est très intéressant.